Hello and welcome to our Mile 27 family. So excited that you're here with us today. I am Cathy Duffy and with me is head coach Andy Dubois. G'day, Andy.
How you doing, Duff? You good today?
Fantastic, my end. No dramas at all. I'm very excited about the topic today, and I know without a doubt, that it's a topic that the listeners will definitely want to hear. We're going to answer one of life's big mysteries. Well, at least it's a mystery for us ultra trail runners, is how do I know I am ready to step up to the 100-kilometre or 100-mile distance? And I think the interesting thing when we look about our own journeys, Andy, is they're both very different. I came off not having a base. I had a 3-year plan that got me to my first 100-kilometre race. But the decision to then step up to the 100-mile distance was actually very different for me. So stepping up to 100 kilometres was more about getting the fitness, being physically ready, learning about ultras. I had to learn about gear, nutrition, race planning, which was much more complex than kind of what I'd imagined. But then stepping up to the 100-mile distance, even though I physically was probably very ready, it was more about psychological readiness for me. And that was about a 5-year process to go from I'm never doing 100 miles to maybe one day, but not yet, to seeing a race that lit a fire. And then I'm on the messenger with Andy saying, let's do this, let's get 100 miles done. By contrast, Andy's introduction was very different. And I do encourage you all to go back if you've not already listened to the Mile 27 Origin Story podcast. And Andy does give a bit of a glimpse into his journey there. And a big difference was he came from a very solid foundation in Ironman triathlon racing. And his first trail ultra was jumping into a race just shy of the 100-mile distance. He went out very hard, learned a bunch of lessons. Again, listen to that podcast. It's excellent, excellent listen. But I'm super curious, Andy, knowing what you know now, would you have advised younger Andy to complete that race at that time?
Yeah, I would have, because I've never been one to do things by halves. I've always been of the mindset. And before anybody wants to kind of take this on as a solid piece of advice, this is not advice for everybody, but I'm always a kind of jump in off the deep end and see if I can swim type of guy, and just find a way to make it happen. Now, it's not the best advice for everybody, because it does depend a bit. I had a big background of, as you said, 10 years of Ironman training, which taught me a lot about the physicality of endurance training and racing and the mental side of things. So I had a lot going on for me, and I think if I'd gone in, which is the more conventional way of doing maybe a few 50Ks and some 100Ks and learning my ultra chops, so to speak, and then go to 100 miles, I don't think I would have got to where I got in the races that I did. I think for me, jumping into 100 miles was thinking or swimming, and I almost sunk, but I learned so much that I got to a point in my second ultra where I wouldn't have got to in the space of literally 18 months from never doing an ultra to doing UTMB. I got there in 18 months, which if I'd done it in 50K, 100K, it would have taken 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Who knows? Who knows where everybody got there. So for me, it worked, but I'm certainly not saying it's the best approach for everyone.
Yeah, look, I love that for our listeners to take on board, that we both of us took two very different approaches, and we've both achieved, success in the ultra space. We've achieved what we've wanted to achieve. We've both raced these distances that we're talking about today. So it's nice. There's many ways to get to the end point. And whilst
No right
today,
answer.
Exactly. And today we're not specifically going to talk about how to train for these events, but what we're going to do is just provide some sort of things to think about in terms of determining whether you're ready to step up to the 100-kilometre or 100-mile race. And we need to look at, are you physically ready? Are you psychologically ready? Perhaps we'll even talk about indications that might point to the fact that you absolutely aren't ready, or perhaps we need to delay it. But we'll go through all of that along the way. So I guess from a physical point of view, if we take Andy's story of having that really strong endurance base, do we know that other sports then translate into the ultra space? If you've got a newer athlete to the ultra trail space coming from a strong foundation elsewhere?
Yeah, look, I think there is definitely some carryover, but I wouldn't take from my story that if you've done Ironman, you can do a 100-mile race as your first ultra. I don't think that was the only factor that helped me get across the finish line in my first ultra. But I think it certainly, from a physical point of view, there is lots to be said, lots to be carried over from having a background in whether it's Ironman or long cycling. You're used to doing 200k bike rides, or even if you're used to doing lots of multi-day hikes. Anybody who's got experience of being on their feet or exercising for long periods of time has a bit of a heads up in doing a 100-mile distance compared to someone who hasn't potentially had that background, just because they're used to what it feels like for exercising for a long period. So there is definitely some transfer over. The biggest thing people without that big background will find is the downhills is where they'll just suffer badly. And you can do stacks of Ironmans, but when you start running downhills, you're just not used to it, and the legs will suffer big time if you haven't done that specific training. But there's certainly some benefits to coming from a big aerobic background in another sport.
And I think it's important for our listeners to take, there's two main points on board there. Was you might be coming from another endurance sport, but you also might be somebody who has done those multi-day hikes, that's taken the family camping and spent a lot of time in nature and climbed mountains, and it might have been in a more informal setting, but that also provides a good groundwork or a launch pad to then build your 100k or 100-mile training from, doesn't it?
I think the advantage of being somebody who spent a lot of time in nature and mountains and trails, whether it be hiking or running or whatever, is you have experience of being in the mountains, particularly if you're going to do a mountain ultra. Obviously, if you're doing a flat road ultra, it's a bit different, but most of us, mountain ultras are more popular kind of ultras out there these days. So if you've got lots of experience on your feet in mountains, the advantages of that is, one, you know what the mountains are like. You get going into a race knowing what you're going to be running because you've hiked similar trails, but also you've got some understanding of how to handle yourself in the mountains. And I know for me, one of the biggest things that I took into the race is my experience hiking all over the world in very, very different conditions. Because once you've hiked in conditions where the rain came in and it started hailing and it started snowing and you had to camp that night, and once you've been hiking really hot conditions and all the different conditions the mountains can throw at you, and you've learned how to deal with that from a practical point of view in terms of how do I keep my body warm, how do I keep my body cool, you can take that. That's a hugely valuable thing to take into an ultra, which you're coming from a road running background and haven't done those multi-day hikes or any kind of hiking in mountain conditions. You just don't have that experience. And I think the race recently in Kosciuszko, Trail Kosciuszko, was a big kind of reminder of that, how vicious the mountains can be. For those who don't know, Kosciuszko, Ultra Trail Kosciuszko was held just a couple of weeks ago, and they had thunder and lightning, hail. The race had paused for a couple of hours. People had to keep warm, and then it was restarted again. Trail was really wet and muddy. It was freezing up the top, strong winds, like weather just threw everything out those competitors. Now, if you're coming from a base of, you've done a few marathons, maybe a few 50k trail runs, but never really spent much time in the mountains, that's going to be really, really challenging to you to understand what you need to do to cope with those conditions. But if you're used to hiking in extreme conditions, like, well, okay, I'm running an ultra instead of doing a multi-day hike, but the principles are the same. So not only do you know what to do, but you have the confidence, the mental kind of strength to go, this is fine, I've dealt with this before, I know what to do, just got to do this, this, and this, and all's going to be okay. Whereas if you've never been in those conditions before, it can be quite challenging and quite intimidating to a lot of people.
Absolutely, and I think it highlights that ultras aren't just about running from point A to point B, doesn't it? Like there's a lot to consider. You spoke about conditioning your quads for downhill running, using your gear in mountainous situations and being able to layer on and layer off appropriately and efficiently so you don't become hypothermic. In the hotter events, how do you manage? So I guess the more experience you have in those environments, the better experience that you can then launch from and then take into the race.
Yeah, I think also it's not only having the experience of hiking and doing those kind of multi-day hikes and stuff before, it's feeling comfortable in that environment. there's a difference between having done it before and feeling confident and comfortable. And when I say comfortable, no one's comfortable running in hail and sleet and gale force winds, but comfortable in the fact that you're confident you've got the skills to get you through that safely. So it's not just about, I've done a few hikes and a few runs in kind of bad conditions. It's like, well, have you done enough that you're confident in yourself that if you get to a peak and there's almost gale force winds and horizontal sleet going to your face and half your body gets numb, that you know what to do and you're going to feel in control of the situation. There's a big difference between being in control of things. I mean, I know you can't control the weather, but being in control of what you can control, both mentally and practically, and just surviving. And I think the longer the race goes, the less it's about the physical demands of the race, and the more it's about mentally how you deal with the challenges that you're faced with. Now, if you've not spent much time in extreme conditions, then when that happens, you're not going to be comfortable. And all of a sudden, the mental load increases massively. It's like if you take someone rock climbing for the first time and you're going with a very experienced rock climber. Now, if you've never done much before and you go rock climbing, like at the end of that little half hour or whatever rock climbing, your heart's thumping like mad and you've got all this adrenaline floating around, like it's a real, like, oh my God, that was amazing. To an experienced rock climber, it's like a warm-up. Like it was nothing to them. There was no stimulus. It was just like walking down to the shops for us. So the same thing, if you're not used to and not comfortable and not confident in those extreme conditions, it's going to be a lot more input to you, and you have to deal with a lot more than somebody who's spent a lot of time in the mountains, a lot of time in extreme conditions, and feels comfortable and confident in doing that. And what ultra is that the extra thing there is, which makes it hard for the female listeners out here, is that confident alone. Can you be on a mountain pass with nobody behind you and nobody in front of you, all alone at 2 o'clock in the morning, and go, I've got this. This is cool. I'm fine with this. It's not a problem at all. Now, it's difficult, unfortunately, for many women to have that experience without, from a safety point of view, it's hard to get out there and spend time alone and develop those skills mentally. Whereas for blokes, we tend to be a bit more less safety conscious, and we don't have to be as safety conscious. So we can go out and spend time alone and not have to worry about things. So it's just an extra challenge that women have to face stepping up to that 100-mile distance.
Yeah, it certainly is. And you see a lot of dialogue around that on, I guess, on a lot of the running forums. And you see a lot of female running groups going out and, people grouping together to, I guess, safety in numbers. And there are certain tricks that, we can go through, I guess, probably a good discussion for another podcast as well. But, there's some safety things that you can do to stay safe in that space. But it definitely is an obstacle, unfortunately, that a lot of us females need to think about, that a lot of males don't necessarily have to consider, because when we are training for these long distances, we need time on legs. And like a lot of my training then became running at night, starting at 11, late into the night, getting up early and being by myself in the mountains alone. And that was, psychologically that was really tough, especially when my brother-in-law then teased me about looking out for the wild dogs. So every sound I heard was like, is that like, what do I do if a wild dog comes for me? But anyway, that's another story. And I not happy with him for putting that thought in my head at all. But I guess if we've got an athlete who doesn't have that experience, so they might have a good fitness foundation, would you then advise them to do build-up races to gradually get that experience, or is that something that they can just do in training?
So anytime you're stepping up in distance, there's always an unknown. So the bigger the jump up, the more the unknowns. So what we're going to try and do in training is control as many of the unknowns, get experience of as many of the unknowns as we possibly can. So what I mean by that is that, if you're doing a road marathon, navigation is not an issue. You just follow the person in front of you, and if you're at the front of the pack, you've got a pace car, like you can't get lost. Once you go to short trail races, they're usually well marked, but not always. So you've got a bit of navigation to contend with. Once you get to long mountain ultras, some of them are well marked, some of them are not so well marked. So navigation can be an issue. So you want to do some navigation skills. Obviously, we just talked about the weather and conditions being an issue. So there was a post on one of the forums I answered recently. This person was based in Adelaide, and they asked about dealing with those conditions at Cozzy. I said, what you've got to do, you've got to seize those cold, wet, blustery, windy days and get up to exposed peaks, get up to Mount Lofty. For those Adelaide viewers, I know what I'm talking about. Get up to Mount Lofty, sit at Mount Lofty for half an hour so you cool down, and then start again and see how much difference that is compared to just getting up and turning around and going back down again, because your body obviously cools down when you have to stay still for a while. But in races, as we saw with Cozzy, you may have to do that. They were held for 2 hours, some of them. So when you're thinking about stepping up, ignoring the training, which we'll talk about later, either here or another podcast, but forgetting the training for a second, you've got to think, well, what are the different things that I'm going to be exposed to from my current race background, whether that's triathlons, road marathons, shorter ultra trail races? What else am I going to be exposed to? What are the challenges I'm going to face? And how can I get some experience with those challenges in either training or racing? Now, some of them might be better off in training. For example, night navigation is probably easier to do by yourself, because night navigation, you have to get a race that's going to take you overnight. And then it's like, maybe it's too long to fit into your training block, and maybe it's too far away, or there's more obstacles. Whereas anybody can go out at 10 o'clock at night. Well, ignoring the safety aspect, I can go out at 10 o'clock at night and do a 3-hour run on trails and download a GPX thing onto their watch and navigate by their watch on trails they haven't been to before and learn about navigating at night. So some things you can do in training, some things are better done in races. Nutrition's a big one that's, people seem to have no problems at all with training nutrition, but comes to a race and all of a sudden their stomach goes bad. So nutrition testing is usually better done in races.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there's a lot that then people need to think about, isn't there? So there might be some hidden gems in that you've got a good background with other sports. You might have been spending a lot of time in the mountains, but you need to actually have time to, I guess, prepare for things specific to ultras, like the night training, the gut training, the gear use and all that kind of stuff. And I'm imagining there's a lot of listeners out there that the cogs are starting to turn, and they're starting to think, yeah, I'm ticking some of those boxes. Like I've spent a lot of time in the mountains. I'm good with my gear, and I've got this pretty good foundation that I can now bounce from and work towards being able to complete these distances. Is there anything else from a physical point of view you think our listeners need to sort of really think about before jumping up?
I think, look, the longer the base you've got, obviously the better. But ignoring that, I think a better thing to consider is your history of injuries. If you're the type of person that is frequently injured, like, historically when you jumped up to the marathon, you suffered quite a few injuries. You might have done a 50K, maybe even 100K, and you've also had injuries building up. Then I think you want to have a period of time where you can train uninjured and feel like you've got a more robust body, because the longer you go, the more likely those niggles will turn into injuries. I mean, I had an athlete the other day he did a 50K, had some ITB issues. I hadn't started coaching him yet, but then he did some exercise to try and fix it up and was fine in his training run. And then like 105Ks into a 110K race, he had to DNF due to ITB turning, like he just couldn't walk basically. So what's been fine in training, once you start extending and extending and extending, the margin for error and the gap between your training and what the race demands gets bigger and bigger, so the risk of injury gets higher and higher and higher. So if you're someone who's quite robust and you really haven't suffered many injuries at all over your running career, then you could be more confident stepping up to the distance, that injuries won't ruin your experience. Whereas if you're someone who's fragile, is probably not the best word, but listeners will understand what I mean. If you're more fragile and you get injured more often, then you probably want to have a bigger, consistent training base before you step up. Because the last thing you want is to sign up for this miler. And if you're doing it in Australia, milers in Australia aren't cheap. Sign up and then get injured 80K into it in DNF. And especially if you've known that you've got a history of injuries, you think, well, why did I think it was going to be any different? Like, why didn't I just put it back for a year, focus on a year of getting consistent training in, uninjured, and then step up to the miler, rather than just going, oh, it'll be fine. Like, well, historically it hasn't been fine. Historically, you've got injured frequently. So
yeah,
if you're going to get injured, it's going to be in a miler.
Yeah, then the question is, for those that fall into the latter, what what kind of base does that look like? Like that consistent training where they've stayed ahead of any injuries or niggles. Like, can we quantify that at all for our listeners?
Not really. I think a better way to quantify is races. Like if you're injury prone historically, then you'd probably want to do a couple of 100Ks before you step up to a miler.
Yep.
Just to give you the confidence that, okay, my body can handle it. Because in 100K, like if you break down at 60 or 70K, you might be able to get through the last 30K and not wipe out the year. But in 100 mile, if you get to 70 or 80K and you break down, you've got 80K to go. It's a massive distance and you're going to DNF. So for those that do get injured more often, I'd probably recommend that getting some 50, 80s, 100K races in the legs and getting that resilience in your injury prevention side of things up will give you the confidence that, yes, I can handle a miler now, rather than a set volume per week. Because volume per week, I mean, I've coached athletes to finish milers on 70 to 80K per week and 120K per week. It just depends on the athlete. So I think a better criteria is finishing 100K races injury free, and that will give you some more confidence.
Absolutely. And as we've already alluded, the physical side is only very much one piece of the puzzle. And it's people often say, you know, the physical side's 10-20%, and it's mental that gets you across the line. And I think back to my first 100K, and for those that know the Ultra Trail Australia, 100Ks in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, Australia, the final part of the race is up these further stairs, which is just shy of 1,000 stairs straight up to get to the finish line. And I remember the first year being down the bottom, and I just I was so close to the end, but I couldn't think about finishing at all. It was insane. The finish line felt so far away. And I remember almost sort of crawling up the stairs as I wheeled myself to the finish. As I crossed the finish line, my body was just like gone. And I really, really felt in that moment that mentally I got myself up those stairs and across that line, because I had nothing left to give physically. So I think the psychological side is something when we're deciding whether to step up to 100K or 100 mile that we really need to have a chat about that as well. And when we were sort of talking about the subject for this podcast, I love the first thing you mentioned, Andy, was it's really important to know your why. And I agree. And I thought it'd just be interesting to, I guess, reflect on what each of our whys were before our first 100 milers, because our whys now might be very different. But before I did my first 100 mile, I'd sort of done some 100Ks and I was finally stepping up, but I felt like I hadn't found my limit. I wanted to see how I would respond when I found my limit or I was pushed near to my limit. And I guess plus I love just spending time in nature, and I just wanted to be out there as long as possible and just see would I step up or would I DNF. And the interesting thing about that experience was that didn't actually happen. That vision that I had didn't happen. I never wanted to DNF. I got to the end, and spoiler alert, I don't feel like I found my limit yet. I still feel like I've got more to give. But what was your why for your first miler, Andy?
So I think just before I go through that, I think you hit a really good point there in terms of why. And I just wanted to discuss the why a little bit, because when it comes to a miler, it's not 90% mental. Like, it's a huge physical component, but the bit that helps bring out that physical training you've done is obviously the mind. And we all know that the more motivated you are to finish, the higher chance you've got to finish. That's it's well supported by all the studies and everyone's personal experience. So when we think about doing a miler, unless the why is really strong, if you're just doing it because a few mates are doing it, but it might be a good idea, then it's unlikely you will dig deep enough mentally to cross that finishing line. So I think the why is something, and we'll probably discuss this a bit later in more detail, but something that you really need to ask yourself why you're stepping up. For me, why I stepped up, it wasn't really stepping up, to be honest, because I'd never done a trail race before. I'd never done an ultra before. It was
I love that.
Yeah,
it was just the one starting step was
yeah, like it was just like, this is back in 2005. I'm showing my age here. So 2006 it was in Scotland was the race. That was my first race. And back then ultras were around, but UTMB started in 2003 or 4. So it'd been around a few years. So the ultra scene was much, much less than what it is now. So there wasn't a big awareness about it. I'd come from 10 years of Ironman, and never heard of an ultra at all until a mate sent me this link to this race, and I went, that looks interesting.
So
and
curiosity sounds like it was part of your why.
Definitely. And look, it wasn't, I didn't do it to take up ultras. I just did it to do a race that looked like fun and looked like a challenge. Now, for me, the challenge, it's all about the challenge. Similar to you, it's all about finding limits and pushing myself to my limits. And with Ironman, I looked at, when I first saw Hawaiian Ironman on TV, I thought that was the pinnacle of physical performance. And I thought, if I can make myself do that, I've really shown myself, prove something to myself that I can do whatever challenge is set in front of me. So when I saw this 95-mile race in Scotland, I kind of thought, that looks like a pretty cool step up. That looks like something different, but something that looks really challenging, something that should get me to that point of not knowing whether I can do it or not, and give me the same kind of buzz that the Ironman did. Because I did a few marathons in between finishing Ironmans, and like, I enjoy marathons, and obviously I was a good marathon runner in my Ironman days, but I didn't get the same buzz. Like, the race starts at 6 a.m, you finish before 9 in the morning. It's like, what do I do for the rest of the day? Like, I'm used to being out there all day long.
Yeah.
So it didn't really give me the same buzz that Ironman did. So when I saw this race, I thought, well, that's got to be like an all-day kind of thing. So let's give it a crack. So yeah, it wasn't really a case of stepping up and
as somebody who prepares over a long period of time to get to my goals, like I love that. I love that. It just shows the differences in people. Like, our journeys are all different, right?
Very different.
And it obviously, like, the curiosity obviously paid off, because here you are in the ultra space, very, very well embedded in it.
Yeah, well, I think curiosity is a good way to look at races. I think the longer the race goes, the more unknowns there are. Now, the more you go into a miler with a set plan on what you think is going to happen, either the times you're going to run, the experience you're going to have, how you're going to feel, the more you go into it with preconceived ideas about that, the less you're going to enjoy the race, and probably the worse your performance is going to be. The more you can go into a race with curiosity, with acceptance, with mindfulness, with confidence that you'll overcome whatever challenges that will be thrown at you, and acknowledging there are going to be challenges thrown at you, and they probably won't be the ones you expected, the more you'll enjoy it and the better your performance will be. So I think curiosity is a really important mindset to go into an ultra with.
Absolutely. And just when you were saying all that, Andy, I definitely had that flashback to some advice you gave me, and I've given to a lot of my athletes since, is if you do the best you can given what you're dealt with on the day. So that's weather changes, your gut might go, they might change the course, you might be held up for 2 hours like they did in Ultra Trail Kosciuszko. If you do the best you can given what's in front of you, you will always finish happy. And I have to agree. Even the DNF I had, I did the best that I could, and I cherish that race so much because of all the things that I learned.
And that's something I try and teach all my ultra athletes, is that mindset of going into a race with dropping those preconceived ideas about what you're going to feel like. Because as we both said then, it's, if you can go in with a clear mind, open to what's going to happen, and confident that you can overcome that, the rewards for that at the end, not only crossing the finish line faster, but just, we've all done ultras where you cross that finishing line and it's like the world is this big happy place. Like, your head's just, you're in this kind of dreamlike state where life is good. You might be physically wrecked, but you see life differently, and you just feel like this is how life should be. This feeling of contentment and at ease with yourself and at one with yourself. And if you've got a crew, the joint working together, that crew helped you to get to that. Like, it's just an amazing experience. So you compare that with someone who crosses the line going, oh man, I was 2 hours slower than what I wanted. Like I got lost. The weather was shit. Oh man, I could have done so much better. Like, there's no need for that attitude. You could drop all that and have the same kind of race and finish the race with such a different mindset. So I'm always trying to tell my athletes to drop those preconceived ideas and just go in with the experience you have and trust that you can get yourself to the end and enjoy the process along the way.
And I think that's a really important point, because a lot of it is sort of dealing with setbacks and any obstacles that come up during the ultra. Like, you're problem solving your way to the end, right? So you may or may not have experience with that in racing at this stage, but you may have experience with that in your life, which you can then take into the race. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think the problem solving thing, I know one of the big things that helped me get through my first ultra was the experience I'd had problem solving in the rest of my life. So Ironman was one thing, but also, you know, I'd hike all over the world by that stage, usually just my wife and I with no guides. You know, I remember we did this one hike in Peru, and you know, this is back in the days before GPS watches and GPS phones and blah, blah, blah. So we couldn't just look at the route on our phone and follow it. We were in Peru. Everyone spoke Spanish. We didn't speak much Spanish at all. We'd heard about this 4-day trek. We knew roughly where it went, but didn't have any maps. We went into a trekking place and asked him for a map, and it was in the middle of a power failure, and he showed us upstairs with like a match, cigarette lighter, to show us this map on a wall. So you catch a bus here, you go here, you go here, catch a bus, and you'll be fine. So okay, all right. And like, maybe it was silly, but we did it anyway. But the point is that once you've had those experiences where you're out there with no safety blanket, like we're in the middle of the Peruvian Andes, like with no guides, nothing, just the two of us with our food and our gear. So no safety blanket. If shit hit the fan, like, it would have been ugly. But once you've had those experiences, you start to back yourself. They think, well, I don't know what the problems are going to be, but I'm going to back myself. I'm going to find a way to get over that. I'm going to find a solution to keep myself moving forward. I may have never been in this particular problem before, but I've been in so many other problems in my life before that I'm pretty sure I can figure out some way to keep going forward in a positive manner. So I think, you know, when that doesn't even have to be multi-day hikes. It could be a business thing. It could be relationship issues, any kind of big issues which you've found a way to get forward. That mental strength you've used to go, I have a problem, I don't know how to solve it, but let's try this and work through it. Like, that's ultras. That's what happens. You get stuck with issues that you come think, oh, I've never foreseen this happen. I did not expect this to happen. Find a way, move forward.
Absolutely. And it does mirror life. So that the example that you gave, it shows the merging of that physical experience. You can't have that physical experience without the psychological side of it as well, and navigating the challenges and getting through. But as you said, it doesn't have to be out in the mountains doing that. Like, we might have sort of parents out there who have got a bunch of kids and who are trying to work and get the kids to sport, and now somebody's sick and you can't get to that business meeting and do that presentation. Like, our life is about managing obstacles and looking ahead and trying to navigate challenges. And it's the same for an ultra. So it's good for our listeners to know that from a psychological point of view, there's a lot of life experiences that you will have, whether it's in your sport or outside of the sport, which you can then take to the ultra experience and enhance it.
I think the big thing for ultras, going on that vein, is that when you're doing a marathon, like, your longest run is probably somewhere between 30 to 35K, maybe 38. So the jump from that to 42 is not much. Like, it's at most like 5 or 10K, which, you know, everyone's done that. You kind of think, well, that's not too big a jump. Now, if you're training for a 50K, you might have done a few 35 to 40K. So it's an extra 10 or 15Ks. Yeah, that's cool. Train for 100K, your long run still might only be 40, maybe 50K. So now you're doing double that. Like, well, that's starting to get a fairly big gap between what I've done in training and what the race demands. Training for 100 miler, the most you might have done in training might be 50, maybe 60K. So now it's an extra 100K on top of what you've done in training. That's a big, big jump. So what you have to consider doing 100K or 100 miler is faith and trust and belief in yourself.
I love that. So true.
You have to have the faith that you can find a way to keep moving forward, so that you can look back on those previous life experiences you've had, and if you're the type that for whatever reason have come across obstacles and found a way to move forward, then you can take that confidence, take that experience you've had doing that, and apply, well, I didn't know how I was going to solve this problem in my life, no matter what it was, but I found a way. So I'm going to take that same faith in myself that I'll find a solution into this ultra. Because, you know, I get asked all the time, and this is what the whole podcast is about, is how do I know I'm ready? Well, thing is, you're never going to know you're ready to do a miler. 100Ks, you can be a little bit more sure, like you've done a few 50Ks and you had a good base of training, and you can be a bit more sure about 100K because less can go wrong. But for 100 mile, you're never ever going to know that you are ready to do 100 mile. It is always a jump off the deep end and seeing whether you can sink or swim. So all you can do is give yourself the tools to swim, using that analogy. Think about all the things you might need to do to keep afloat and say, well, I've trained my nutrition, I've trained the physical side of things, I've had all this experience mentally of overcoming obstacles and challenges and stuff in my life. Like, put them all together. Plus, a few of my mates have done it, and like, they don't like. I feel like I'm in the same ballpark as them, so I'm just going to have to trust myself. I'm just going to have to go, yep, I think it's time to do it.
Geez, if that doesn't encourage our listeners to sign up to a race, I don't know what will. I tell you what, my palms have gone a little bit sweaty. Because it's true, right? Because you have to put it on the line and take that leap of faith, and you have to be prepared. Or I know a lot of listeners will, I guess, it'll resonate with. I know there's a whole group of people out there that have this fear of failure. Like, well, what if I don't do it? It's like, well, what if? Like, failure is an opportunity to grow and learn. If you've done your best, given what's ahead of you, you will always finish happy. And I think that's another important question, is how do you handle those sorts of situations? Are you prepared not to finish? Are you prepared to put it all on the line? That's something you need to consider as well, isn't it, Andy?
Very, very much so. I was just about to talk about that, because if you're training for a marathon, road marathon, you can pretty much estimate fairly accurately what your finish time is going to be. And you might say, well, based on my training, I've done a few half marathons, I think I can do 3 hours 30. And then, you do the race, and either you do 3 hours 30 or a bit quicker, or you blow up and you go slower. And if you blow up, you're disappointed and you go back. Like, that's how it goes. Whereas with ultras, you've got no idea what time you're going to finish. Like, if at all you're going to finish, you just don't know. So if you're the type that wants to sign up to a race with some degree of certainty on A, yes, you're going to finish, and B, yes, you're going to finish in less than 24 hours, or yes, you can definitely make the cutoff, it's no issues at all, then you're probably going to come unstuck at some stage doing long ultras, because they're not like that. You have to be prepared to miss cutoffs. You have to be prepared to DNF. You have to be prepared to fail in what most people think is a fail, but I wouldn't consider it a failure. It's just a learning experience en route to more ultras. You have to be prepared to jump into that deep end and go, look, I've enjoyed the training and I've enjoyed the experience of the race so far, but unfortunately I'm going to have to DNF. But it can't be like, I say to all my athletes, if you're only doing a 100-mile race to see the view at the top of the mountain, as in the finish line, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. Because very often in 100-mile races, that finishing line is either much, much further away than you thought it was going to be. Like, you might have said, I think I can do 24 hours, and 32 hours later, you cross the finishing line. So if you set yourself up for 24, then that can be really disappointing. Or you don't even get to the finish line. So if you're climbing that mountain just to see the view at the top, then you're going to be very, very disappointed. But I like to use the analogy of, like, if you're a mountain climber, the main purpose of you climbing a mountain is not to see the view at the top. It's just to get to the top and enjoy the process along the way. And even if they don't get to the top, mountaineers will say it was too risky or whatever, we didn't make the top, but they still had that experience of trying to summit. Now, if you go into a race just thinking, I want to finish, I want to get that finisher's medal, I want to cross that finishing line, and that's your sole motivating factor, I think you need to kind of question how you're viewing that race, because you're going to be disappointed at some stage, quite badly disappointed. Whereas if you can view it as, look, this is going to be an experience, the training is going to be an experience, I'm looking forward to seeing how I respond to putting into more miles, I'm looking forward to spending more time on the trails in my long runs, I'm looking forward to spending time on the trails with other people in the race, I'm looking forward to the challenges that the race throws at me. I know me personally, I like that point in the race where the shit hits the fan. Because you feel good for a while, whether it be 40K, 60K, or 80K, but eventually, like, shit gets real.
Oh,
and you go,
it will hit the fan. It'll hit the fan.
For me, it's a case of, right, okay, now we're racing. Now, this is what I've trained for. I've trained for when the shit hits the fan. I've trained for when the fact my legs don't want to run anymore, or I've just puked up my stomach because the stomach's not feeling good, or I've got lost, or the weather's just kind of bucketed. Like, the shit hits the fan. So for me, the biggest rewards in ultras is overcoming that and finding a way to finish. Now, whether you're finishing ahead of time, on time, or 5 hours slower, me personally, I couldn't care less. I've had races where I finished way slower than what I thought I might do, and races I finished faster, and they've all been very rewarding races. So I think you've got to go in with the right mindset of being prepared to DNF, being prepared for it not to pan out how you thought it might be, but be 100% okay with that. Just like if you go to climb a mountain purely to see the peak and it's all clouded over, are you going to go, well, that was a friggin' waste of time. What did I bother doing that for? Well, don't do it. If you're that mindset, don't do an ultra, because there's no guarantees you'll see anything from the top.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important. Like it's the obstacles that enriches the actual ultra. Like that first 100-mile race that I did, there was this distinct point where I left a checkpoint going to the night section, the most technical section, and I was way sort of past the checkpoint, and I realized I actually forgot to put water in my water bladder. And to tell you what my mind went through in that first 60 seconds was, I think everybody could probably imagine, because I had some choices to do. I actually did try and ring you, Andy, but the reception was really bad because I didn't. But I just centered myself and I got through it and I did it. And it's a part of the story that I love, because it really solidified one of the lessons around obstacles will happen and how do you approach them. And as we said, there's obstacles in our everyday life. It's just we just apply the same sort of principles to our ultras just to get to the end, which is really important. And the emphasis on the journey. I've got one athlete who wasn't particularly excited about racing, but did sign up for UTA 50 just because it was a way to keep him honest with his training. But he loved the training sessions with friends and the lunches afterwards, and then the whole group did the actual event and then the debriefing afterwards. So it was this big, wonderful social event that became a really precious experience for him. So it was very much the journey. The race was just the icing on the cake, so to speak.
Icing on the cake, yep, exactly. And something that, for those of you who are more performance orientated, you might be thinking, well, surely I would do better if I focused on times and paces and stuff. But the research on this has shown that the more you focus on the processes during the race, the better your outcome will be. So the more you can focus on what you can control in the race, the faster your finishing time is going to be. So we need to let go of those, not so much to let go, because when you're at the end, you want to finish on the podium or whatever, but they're the secondary kind of goals. The primary goals are staying present and focusing on what you have to do at each particular moment to get you through the race. So I think that's a really important thing. The other thing that I have, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. I was going to move on, so you go.
I've lost my train of thought, so you go. I'll come back to
No, all I was going to say is I think our discussion, so far, has shown that the physical side is sort of, I guess, one portion, but the bigger obstacle is likely between our ears and our thought processes and the commitment to it and accepting the risk of not finishing and all those sorts of things. How would you weight the importance or the ratio between the physical and the psychological? Would you give them even weighting, or do you think you'd much prefer to have an athlete who's physically ready and perhaps psychologically not, or can you not separate them out?
Yeah, look, I think I don't want to put a number on it because it's a bit cliche to say it's 20% mental and 80% physical or whatever. But I think it depends on the athlete. And what I mean by that is the slower the athlete is, the more physical side of things becomes an issue. So what I mean by that is if you take, say, someone who's a 3-hour marathon type runner versus someone who's like a 4-hour marathon type runner, and you push them up to 100 miles. Now, assuming they've done similar training, then the 3-hour marathon runner is going to be moving at a faster pace. So if she hits the fan, they've got more time to deal with stuff because the cutoffs aren't as pressing. So they're not kind of looking at their watch and going, I've only got half hour for the next cutoff. It's a much easier thing. You can stay at an aid station for 4 hours and go from being vomiting to feeling okay again, get back in the race and finish the race. Okay, you've lost 4 hours, but you finished. Whereas if you're slower physically, then you have a much smaller margin of error and you have to be on the ball much more than someone who's faster physically. So for the slower athletes, you can't get away from the fact that there's cut-offs, and if you're moving slower, you've got less time to deal with the shit that happens. Faster athletes, obviously, they want to finish faster, so it's not to say that they've got it easier. They want to finish faster. So I think you can't really split them. I think even if you're physically better prepared, unless you've had those mental challenges throughout your life, or unless you're the type of person that can be open and just, because some people don't know until they've been put in the situation. Some people have never had any kind of really challenging experiences, then all of a sudden they're thrown into this thing and they find out how tough they actually are. Now, whether that be a race, whether that be a car accident, or it could be anything at all. But some people's lives, for whatever reason, they've just cruised along. Nothing really bad's ever happened. They've never been challenged. All of a sudden, they get into a challenging situation and they go, "Wow, didn't know I was made of that. I didn't know I had that in me." Like, fantastic.
Well, I love that. It's a nice sort of safer space to check your check your mental fortitude,
exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Whereas for others, they'll find that, wow, I really struggled in that situation. I found myself really challenged by the weather, by whatever it was. And look, that's fine. Like, it doesn't mean you're weak. It just means, of all the things that go into doing an ultra, all the factors, physical, mental, nutritional, everything that goes in, you've identified a weakness. You found that this happened during the race and you were very mentally challenged by that, whether you DNF'd or just walked way more than you should have, or whatever it was. That's just something to work on. It's just a learning experience to go, right, well, what can I do next race to get stronger at that? So next time that happens, I've got the mental and physical and practical skills to deal with that. So yeah, I don't really want to put numbers on the physical and mental, because I don't think you can really split them. And look, science says we can't split them. Science says that physical affects mental and mental affects physical. So I think that is, you can't really split it.
I love that, and it's what I suspect anyway. You need both to get from A to B. You need both to actually get through the training. I think they're both equally important. So if we've actually ignited, I guess, some interest in some of our listeners, and they're thinking, you know what, I'm going to do this, and they're thinking about stepping up, I think race choice is also important as well. And something that you always taught me was to pick a race that speaks to you. And I know my first 100 mile was on paper a very hard one to do, but there was just something about that race that just spoke to me.
I think unless you, as we talked about before, we talked about the why, we talked about having that strong motivation. And I think race choice is particularly important for your first 100 miler. And I say that because you want to give yourself as much motivation as you possibly can to help you drag you through the last 60K or so. So I think it's really important to pick races that really speak to you, really motivate you in a way that gets you excited. So for example, when I'm looking at potential races for either myself or for clients and I'm suggesting stuff, if you're looking at race videos and you kind of go, yeah, it looks pretty cool, looks nice, like, well, then move on. When you look at race videos that makes your heart beat a few steps faster and gives you kind of like tingling in your cheeks and your fingers, like, well, okay, now we've got something. Now we've got something that's really excited you. And unless you have that, it's likely you will fall apart in the back end of a miler because you just haven't got that deep motivation. And I've seen it time and time again where athletes have picked races and said, look, I think I'm going to give this one a go. And we've talked about it. Me personally as coach, I don't think it's the best race for you. They go, no, I really want to do it. Okay. And sure enough, I get a message after the race, Andy, I pulled out at whatever, just 120K and 30K. And we talked about it and they said, I just didn't really, I couldn't care if I finished or not. I got to the point where the shit hit the fan and I just didn't care. Like DNFing was just like my crew's there. There's a nice warm car to get, I could be back with my family. I didn't care anymore. And like, that just shows the race selection wasn't optimal because you want to care. You want to care big time. You've invested months and months and months of training into this race and you want to get to that 120K mark and go, I care. I want to finish. Like, this is all I've been thinking about for ages. And I know for me, when I pick races, like usually the last thing I think about before I go to sleep each night is the race. And I'm running that race in my head. I think I talked about it in the origin story with the Ironman. But unless it's occupying your thoughts on a regular basis and getting you excited about it, getting you wondering if you've done enough training or not. That's a good thing to feel like that. People think, oh, I'm so worried about have I done enough training? Well, that means you care. Like, you're getting nervous about the race. That means you give a shit about it, you know. And I've had a few discussions with people, you know, pre-race saying, I'm nervous and I'm a bit worried about it. So that's good. If you weren't nervous, I'd be very, very worried, because if you're not nervous before a race, it means you don't really care about it. People think that elites in any endeavor don't get nerves, but if you talk to elite athletes, you talk to elite, you know, bands with some of the biggest names in the world, elite public speakers, they all get nervous before they go on stage or before they perform. It's the fact that they tap into those nerves as being a positive thing, and it means this is important to them rather than being something that scares them off. So I think unless the race really talks to you, then I think you should keep looking.
100%, because they're all hard, right? They're all hard. So they're all hard. They're all going to take a sort of a toll on you, and to some degree. So you need to pick one that means something to you. And I think that was one of, you know, a key bit of advice when I chose mine, and that led me to the success, because I was so invested in this adventure that I'd planned before me. Loved the experience. So I think it's clear that doing, like, stepping up in distance is a big commitment, and you need the mental and sort of physical space to train. Can we articulate for those people who are thinking, oh, I'm not sure if I can fit it in, can we articulate how much time they need to invest in these training events, or again, it's just too individual?
We can. Before we go on to that, I just had a thought on the previous thing we were just talking about. In terms of picking races, like, you find a race that excites you, you also have to look at the skill demands of that race. So, for example, you might look at a sky race, a 100K sky race in, I don't know, Spain or Canary Islands or whatever, or the Alps or whatever, and you say, oh, that looks amazing, look at the mountains, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at it and you look at some of the terrain, you go, that's highly technical. What are my skills? Have I got the skills to do that race? Now, if you're someone who's run in the Blue Mountains a few times and you're looking to do a highly technical race in the Alps that involves snow, really steep climbs, really narrow kind of trails along tops of mountains and stuff like that, you've got to ask yourself, well, have I got the skills to do this race based on what I've seen? And if you haven't, have you got the means to train those skills? So some of my clients, for example, have gone and done mountaineering courses. So they've spent time, you know, mountaineering, and that experience means that now when they go on to races in the Alps, and both of these clients have done that, they've been on these races that are very, very technical in parts, you know, really steep descents, snow-covered, you know, slopes, etc. And they're now, I wouldn't say their comfort zone, but they've been in that zone enough times to go, I know what to do. Whereas if you've never been in that zone, never had the skills, never developed the skills to do that, then you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment, in that, you know, either you're going to freeze, you're just going to get to those skills and go, oh no, I'm out, or you have an accident. So I think it's important to not be too overconfident in what you want to do, even if you get excited about a race, and think about what skills does this race entail. Another example would be, say, Badwater, you know, the 135-mile race in the US, in the hottest part of the US. You know, if you are not good at dealing with the heat, and you have a history of, you know, fainting or whatever in hot weather, I think you really need to reconsider whether you want to do Badwater. Like, I think you want to do some hot races in Australia first, or wherever you live, you know, get used to running in the heat of the day and get confident in handling that before you signed up for something like that. So I think you always got to look at, okay, well, here's the skills I've got, here's the skills of the race. Is there a commonality between them? They don't have to be, you don't have to have all the skills necessary, but if all your skills are in one circle and all the race skills are in another circle and there's no common ground, you probably need to either go back and get those skills or think about a different race.
Absolutely. Now, and I think the key is, do you have the means then to develop them, which is exactly what you said. Yeah. So for example, UTMB, I got myself into an altitude chamber and things like that. So by the time we did the high points in the race, I didn't feel the impacts at all. So you really need to know what race you're training for and what skills you need, and develop those in as part of your training.
Yeah. Now, onto your question before I interrupted. Mm-hmm. In terms of training, you've kind of looked at a miler or 100K and you've gone, this race really speaks to me. I'm really keen to do it. Like, it really excites me. I think I'm ready. Training wise, look, if you're doing 100K races, the jump up in training to a miler is really not that much. For most people, your Monday to Friday training probably won't change much at all. All that will happen is that your long run might be a little bit longer. You'll get a few more 5 to 6 hour days on your legs, and maybe a couple of what I call adventure weekends, where you might go out, to the Blue Mountains if you're in Sydney, or to the Dandenongs, or to Bright, or if you're in Australia, or wherever you're based, into some mountain trails and spend the weekend where it's not really what I would call a run, so to speak. You're just spending 8 to 10 hours on your feet, running some of it, hiking some of it, getting used to spending a long time on your feet over a day or two. So, when I did UTMB, I was living in London. All my training was in Hampstead Heath, except for one day, which I did 12 hours out in the Welsh Hills. That was my only long day. Other than that, my longest one was 4 hours. So if you're doing 100K, doing 100 miles, not that big a jump up in training to finish. Obviously, if you really want to excel, you want to be doing a bit more. But for most people, the gap in training from 100K to 100 miles is not much. Physically, mentally, it's a big jump up for all the reasons we talked about. If you're going from 50K to 100K, or from marathon to 100K, it kind of really depends on what your race is and what your training background is. And the reason I say that is, if you look at a race like UTA, where the cutoffs for the 100K are 26 hours, I think?
26 or 28, yeah, roughly around there, around like 28. Yeah.
Which, if you hiked 90% of that, you would make the cutoffs. You don't have to run much of that. Assuming you can hike well, you don't have to run much of that to finish it. So if you're a runner only doing, say, 40K a week, but you're doing some long hikes on the weekend, you've probably got enough to finish under the cutoffs. Now, a lot of you would say, well, I don't just want to finish under the cutoffs. I actually want to run as much of it as I can. Also, okay, well, now it's a different story. So now we're thinking about, well, you were doing a marathon or shorter. You probably don't need to run any more distance if you're marathon training to 100K. So if you're running effectively for a marathon, you're probably doing 60 to 80K a week of actual running. So for 100K, you probably don't need to do much more. You probably cover some more distance, and you'll definitely spend more time training, because the distance covered is going to take longer because you're on trails, and you're going to cover more distance because you're going to be hiking some of that as well. So the time invested is going to be more. So if you're doing 60 to 80K for a marathon, road marathon, you're probably running 6-7 hours maybe at most. Whereas for 100K, you probably want to be thinking about, can I get 8 to 10 hours in? And for a miler, probably 8 to 12 hours in, as a real ballpark minimum, with lots of caveats in terms of your expectations of how well you're going to finish and stuff. But just as a general rule. I'm
imagining some of our listeners getting really excited hearing some of those numbers, and all the cogs are turning, and they're realizing that, oh, this I could fit this in. This is possible. This is something that I can work towards, which is exciting. I love the journey of building up and training and then completing an ultra. Is there any advice that you would give to our listeners, which would be a clear reason that perhaps you're not ready to step up? And you alluded to some earlier, like around the space of injuries, but is there anything else that would be a maybe just not yet?
Yes, there is. And I've had another thought on what we were talking about, which I'll elaborate first.
Yeah.
In terms of volume, I don't want people to think that you can finish a miler with 60K training a week, but also don't want them to think you need to do 120K a week. Now, as a coach, I've coached literally thousands of athletes. And I've seen athletes finish a miler with 50 to 60K a week of training, including hiking. And I've seen people DNF a miler with 100K a week of training. Now, there are lots of factors that go into that, but I think the more experience you've got, and experience, we talked about all the different experiences you could have that would help a miler earlier in this podcast, the more of that you have and the more mental strength you have based on those experiences, the less physical training you can get away with. So those athletes who have finished milers with 60K have come from a massive Ironman background, or done lots of hikes or mountaineering all over the world. So they've got a lot to fall back on. But if you're a road runner who's never hiked in the mountains before and you're doing 80K a week, you've probably got less chance of finishing than somebody who's only doing 60K a week with all that experience. So it's not just a case of the volume. It's a case of everything else you've done and the experiences you've had that sways the numbers one way or the other. So I think you need to think about not just the amount of training you can do, but what life experiences you bring that will give you the confidence to give you that thing that you need to get from 80k to 160k in a miler. In terms of whether you shouldn't do a miler or not, look, I would never go, or very, very rarely go into a miler with an injury. So anybody who's done races will know that in the month or two before a race, you'll often see people selling their entries because they're injured. I think that's wise. I think whilst you might get through a 50k and maybe even 100k, depending on the niggle, a 100 miler will find you out. You will, like, it's very, very rare you can go into a miler with a niggle. And I'm not talking about a taper niggle. We all get taper niggles where everything's fine, and all of a sudden, 10 days before the race,
everything hurts in taper. Everything
Yeah.
hurts, and you're always starting to get sick in taper, and just everything just falls apart. Yeah.
So I'm not talking those niggles. I'm talking niggles you've had for quite a while that have. Now you might have been able to still train, but like it's been impacted. So I caution against going into a miler with a niggle. I'd also caution against going into milers depending on the cutoff. Some milers are pretty tight in their cutoffs. So, for example, Down Under 135, it's a race in Victoria, which has fairly strict cutoffs to the point where I think only like 8 or 9 people have finished and only 1 female have finished.
Yeah.
So I think not many. So if you're going into a race like that, and there's another one like, I don't know, Rinjani, which is a race in Lombok, which has like 15,000 meters of vert. And again, it only ever gets a couple of people finishing each year. So if you go into a race like that where the finishing rate is very, very low, you've got to either be 100% prepared. Look, I'm probably not going to finish. I'm going to give them my best shot, don't get me wrong, but I'm probably not going to finish. I just want to see how far I can get. That's fine. But if you're going in there thinking I'm going to finish and you clearly haven't got the training to finish, then I think you need to question your motivations on why you're doing this race, because it's pretty clear you're going to get nowhere near the finishing line. I think going into races where you have no experience in the conditions is a big red flag. You're just opening yourself up for not only injury, but putting yourself at risk. So I use the example of sky running and technical races. You know, if you've never been in the mountains before and you sign up to a super technical race and you get 3/4 of the way up and you roll your ankle and you've never been in scree slopes before covered with snow, it's like you're just making life hard for volunteers and rescue crews. Like you probably shouldn't have been there in the first place because you've never been on a scree slope, you've never been in snow before, you've got no experience outside of trail running on those terrains. Like I would caution against going in races where you just don't have the skills that the race needs.
Because ultras are in often very remote locations and they're not easy to access you if something goes wrong.
And look, that's something that you need to keep in mind. It's like, who's going to rescue you if something does go wrong? Because sometimes rescue can be quite a way away. Like, particularly some of the more remote races, it might be you're relying on the next competitor to come past to see that you're in trouble, to then get to the next checkpoint, to then radio help, to then get a helicopter in to get you. And that could be hours and hours and hours. And that comes down to mandatory gear, which is probably not a topic we want to delve into deeply today. But now that's why we're so big on mandatory gear, is like because that kind of stuff does happen, and which is why you need to have experience in conditions like that and to know what gear you need. Like my personal experience, like I've never run a trail race before when I did my first race, but having hiked in mountains all over the world in very challenging conditions, I knew what gear was needed to keep myself warm in challenging conditions. So I had no fears and no reservations about putting myself in those conditions because I'd been there before. Whereas if you haven't, then you have to question, have I got the skills to do this race?
I hope that we've inspired a lot of you out there, and I'm sure that we have. And if you've got more questions in this space, please reach out to us. We love talking about ultras, don't we, Andy? And we're more than happy to answer any questions. But if you do have them, contact us on the mile27.com.au website. Also, please, if you do like these podcasts, subscribe to them, and that way you'll be alerted when there's a new podcast that comes out. We're very excited that you enjoyed us today. Thank you for coming, and we're grateful that we can take you the extra mile.
Thanks, everybody. See you next
Thanks.
time.